Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello, magical beings. I'm so glad you're here with me today for this very special episode. In my own humble opinion, if you clicked play and then you decided to listen to this episode today for whatever reason, you're in for a very special treat because the episode that I'll be sharing here today is a panel discussion that I hosted and recorded with my friends, classmates, and colleagues who we were together in an astrology embodiment container called Meteorite. So throughout 2021, I was part of an incredible community of astrologers who have graduated from that beginner's level learning, right? Or stage of like learning the planets, the signs, the houses, and the basic meanings of all of those. And this community, we were really committed to embodying our own relationship with astrology more fully and to explore what that might mean for us in a communal setting. It was facilitated by one of my teachers, Sabrina Monarch, who is an astrologer and a writer primarily practicing a branch of astrology called evolutionary astrology. In this conversation, we discussed the idea of astrology as a future language. We also discussed the idea of the spirit of language, our own personal experiences learning astrology, and what it means to be human beings who interact with the vast possibilities of the astrological language. If you had a chance to listen to episode 1, which is a solo episode where I spoke about what the name of this podcast, Healing the Spirit, is all about, you probably also remember me talking about the idea of astrology as future language, as well as how that idea came to me. If you haven't, feel free to check out that episode, but please know that it's not a requirement for you to follow along with our discussion here. There is one thing that I would like to address before we get into the panel discussion, which is the idea that astrology is a language. For some of you listening, perhaps you've been learning astrology for some time and you've heard this phrase that astrology is a language, and that may be very obvious to you. And others hearing this may be like, I never thought of it that way. Well, astrology is admittedly a lot of things, but the one facet that we really dialed into within this discussion is astrology as an archetypal language. What does that mean exactly? Okay, so let's say your sun is in Cancer. You may see one internet meme saying, Cancers are crybabies, which I'm sure you've heard of a lot. And then you may also be doing a little digging and then find a website that says Cancer is associated with the mother energy. And if you stop and think about this a little critically, you may be a little bit like, What? So is Cancer the mother or the baby? Well, the answer is yes, exactly. That's the heart of what we call archetypal languages. Archetypal languages are symbolic, and one symbol can mean many different things, right? Depending on the context. And because symbols are slippery and they resist strict categorization, they provide a beautiful opportunity for us to see our complexity, our multivalence, and our humanness reflected back to us. So before I get into the episode, I would like to just speak out the names of the lovely, brilliant people that you'll be hearing from today. They are Verena, Sabrina Monarch, Mirella Trimboli, Kelly Chalmers, Jenny Chu, A.S. Katoch, or we also call him Rudy, Maddie Gajewski, Fabiola Calvo, and Nicole Elise. I would love for those of you listening to connect with them, and I will be including their information in the show notes. You will see that I've created very, very detailed show notes with time markers and everything to indicate who's speaking when. So if you hear something incredible that really resonates with you and you're curious about who said it and you want to connect deeper with them, you will have the opportunity to check out these show notes and see who said it. And then maybe you can reach out to them, whether that's to simply let them know that you really appreciated their perspectives on this episode, or even book a session with them. All right. As you may know, one of my intentions in creating this podcast is to create a communal space where we weave conversations to envision and embody exactly the future we would like to birth through the lens of astrology, archetypal languages, and art. And seriously, listening back to this conversation, I feel like this conversation does exactly that. And that's why I'm super, super excited to share this conversation with you. All right, let's get into it. Welcome, everyone. So I'm really excited to be with all of you in this space today. Really, we're going to be exploring together this idea of the future language because I feel like the seed of the vision for this project was really planted in Sabrina's intensive, where at the end we all kind of shared our life stories and shared our charts together. And I was really impressed by that because I felt like something emerged in that space, which, you know, all of us in Meteorite has been. We've been through that course and through that experience. And I feel like a new way of being, at least for me, really emerged in that space of collectively looking at our charts, sharing our life stories, and really kind of connecting to something greater than each of us individually. My sense is that language is a living thing in and of itself, and that language is not just a messenger, because I think often in our more mechanistic way of looking at the world, the ways that we've been conditioned and educated to see language has been very utilitarian, like as if language is simply a way to get from point A to point B. And yes, all of that is true. You know, language definitely moves information. Language transmits feelings, and also it transports visions from one person or one entity to another. But whenever we relate to language and whenever we invoke language, I feel like there's a way in which, whether we're conscious or not, we as a personal, as a collective, really kind of touch in or get into the spirit of language itself. And, you know, in astrology, I feel like we're all aware of that because we talk about Mercury as its own like entity, as its own thing. And so, you know, Hermes or Mercury in astrology or in the mythology is really an archetype with its own personality, with its own character, and even with its own agenda. So similarly, I feel like my own felt sense of language is that it has its own spirit, and how we collectively and personally relate to the spirit kind of changes over time. And so I feel like there's something really exciting that I want to explore in real time with all of you around this idea of language having its own spirit, and also to learn and use, you know, in this space, I feel like we're really using and learning and investigating language with such deep reverence and curiosity that there's potential to insert our collective, and by collective I mean like within this group, right, our collective hopes and dreams into the picture. Because if this spirit of the language is kind of an animate thing, right, not only does it change us, or not only is it in communication with us, but we also are in communication with that spirit of the language itself. Before we press record, or at least I press record, I guided us through kind of an arriving exercise where I asked us to really connect with our breath. And to me, like, this idea of inspiring, came from the Latin of inspirare, which is like, roughly it translates into breathing into something. And so I feel like, I want to open up the space to all of you, because I'm curious to hear, before we really move into the more collective aspect, on a personal level, how has, living, studying, contemplating through the lens of astrology, how has that taught you something about your personal relationship with language? And also feel free to give any context, with maybe any stories or anecdotes about how you perceive language, or how you communicate using language before and after you study astrology, if you notice that there are any evolution or change to that.
I can share something. I think that, my relationship to Mercury and language has so much evolved since I know the language astrology. And especially, I think that it is no coincidence that I found evolutionary astrology, which is, for me, as a person who comes from Germany, not very common, and that I study all things about astrology since the beginning in English. So I had this challenge to study a new language, astrology, in another language, English. And I think alone this fact has for sure made me think about language, and has evolved my language and the foreign language, English. So to communicate in two new languages with astrology and English. And exploring my own chart, I found out that Mercury is such an important point for me, and that I have him as an evening star in Gemini in the 12th house. And that when I look at the ruling planets of all the planets, everything comes back to Mercury. And I really, I think I evolved in loving relationship to Mercury, and I really love him. And when you talk about him, I just have to smile, because I think Mercury is such an wonderful, really wonderful archetype. He's the magician, he's the trickster. He can go to the Pluto, to the underworld, to the Hades. He can climb above the Olymp. He can go to the heavens. He's a shapeshifter. And as you said, I think that language is something we can create worlds with language, and the world makes something with language. So world and language is in both sides in exchange. And for me, I think that my whole idea what language is really opened up, and my left brain exploded into the heavens with astrology, and totally opened up this whole topic, what language is, and how we can create language, and how we can create with language as well. And for me personally, it was that I reflected that I always, or how important language always has been for me. And I have a Mercury Sun conjunction and Mercury is opposing my moon. So I reflected back to my childhood, and that I have written stories all the time, and that my teachers, when I was a little girl, always said that I write stories where you can read between the lines. And already as a child, there was this theme of there is something between words. There's some meaning that is beyond the literal word or the sentence, that you can talk without words. Astrology helped me to open up this whole topic.
I was thinking as you were speaking about how, as a songwriter, I think a lot about how language is always in communication or kind of in a dance with something else, right? Because when you're writing songs, you're writing not just the lyrics, but also the melody. And sometimes the most banal lyrics can be the best, or like the most banal words can just be the best lyrics because they really kind of interact with the melody. But anyways, I feel like that kind of speaks to what you're saying too about how language is expansive and there's something to be gleaned between the lines.
Yeah, and even my astrological practice is so combined with writing. So I think I explore the archetypes by writing about them.
I wanted to share as well that, before I got into astrology, at the way that I'm into it now, I was into literature. And my favorite kind of thing to read was poetry or prose fiction that pinpointed an extreme nuance of experience. I wanted to read something that I'd never read before, and not at the level of plot, because I think there's that question, can you create a new story, or has every story already been written and we're just writing variations of the same stories, right? But with language, like, can someone describe something that I've never heard anyone name before? Like, that was what I was always searching for. And when I would find that kind of writing, I would feel electrified, like in my psyche, in my actual body too. And then when it came to astrology, finding these astrological texts, say like Jeffrey Wolf Green's writing, where the language itself is so penetrating that I have a change in consciousness from reading it, that I see something about myself, or see a pattern, or like have the experience of reading something that constellates a whole memory stream of all these, maybe 20 different times I've had that experience that this thing is touching. And the actual language is kind of this mix of abstract, like it's broad enough to contain like the range of an experience, but it's also highly specific energetically, like it's a theme. But I find that language, just day-to-day conventional language doesn't always touch that deep, like micro nuance of human experience. But I think that astrology delineations really can. And that the more we're practicing this language, and we already know the sun signs and, or the zodiac signs and the planets at a general level, that you just keep going deeper and deeper. And the image that has come to me when I think about this process of transformation is like a sheet of ice, and then a needle going into the sheet of ice and the ice dissolving. And that there's all these micro layers of like, I'll read something or receive a delineation and I feel shattered in the best way and like open to life, but it's just a thin sheet of ice, right? And maybe there's those moments of those more, huge realizations or something, but I feel like the deeper in the practice of astrology, it's just those little acupuncture-esque adjustments of the language that spark some kind of deeper opening.
It's also amazing to me how sometimes within the context of talking about our own charts, whether that's a peer or an actual consulting astrologer can reflect to us basically just in a slightly different word what we just said to them, and yet it becomes so nourishing. Like there's something in the act of that reflecting that really opens something up, I think.
Definitely.
I'll chime in because as I've been really learning the language of astrology, I've also been learning Italian. So astrology became a part of my life just a little bit before I decided to make the move to Italy. And so that's been an interesting experience, I think, around language, because for me, I always just had the one language, just English, even if growing up around me, my relatives and even my dad were speaking their dialect of where they come from in Italy. It was like background noise. It didn't seem to concern me. It wasn't really something that I felt like I was a part of. And I even took for granted that, growing up in Australia, but with Italian family as well, you have your own language. They've made their own language, but I wasn't hyper aware of it. I think I just took it for granted, like this is our subculture. We speak English in this way. We just make our own words to describe our own experiences. Came really naturally, and going to school, going to university, and then, in my teaching career, I've always felt like I had a real mastery of the English language and really enjoyed crafting sentences. I've always enjoyed that. I loved writing essays for the subjects that required it, because I just really enjoyed the process of crafting a sentence, a paragraph, an essay, everything like that. And I think, my Mercury in a sixth house speaks of that anyway, like this language as a craft. Anyway, jumping to this more recent experience, I felt like I had to, with astrology and with learning Italian, I felt like I had to really apply a very academic mind, like I had to really effort it. And that wasn't working at first for either. And I was very frustrated because I've never had a problem learning anything. And I didn't understand why I was finding the learning of both challenging. And I think I realized it about astrology first. Or I allowed it more because I think I thought, okay, well, astrology is a science, but an art. So there's a certain allowing of the language to come to you. And of course, that's what you do as a kid. Like when you learn your first language, you allow the language comes to you. You allow it in. You don't effort it, because that doesn't even mean anything when you're a kid. You don't put a lot of effort into walking. You don't put a lot of effort in touching your hand to your nose. Like these are things that just you allow them. You allow. And I started to do that with astrology first, I think, realizing that by doing that, I can tap into so much more, and I can make so many more connections, and I can have much more fluidity with engaging with the archetypes, with the blending houses and signs together, with the planets and the aspects and all the things, and explain them and find the nuance for the particular person and their chart that I might be looking at. And it was from an allowing. And it happens more naturally than I would expect. I have that nervous tension where I think, oh my God, I will not be able to figure this out. And then I realized, no, I won't, not with my mind. I need to allow and let it come to me and wash over me, and then put that together. So the language, and so I've realized that with Italian as well. The more effort I try to put into like learning grammar instead of just letting it wash over me and experience it. And then I think you can speak it. It's there. Like just allow, just let go. And yeah, I can have a whole conversation. It's not a problem. But if I think, what's the structure? I lose it all and I can't grasp it. So it's been, I think this is just a huge lesson for life anyway, like the lesson of allowing versus putting effort. But yeah, it's been like, this has been a big theme, and I didn't realize until really we had this conversation that the way that they're like having to learn this new language or choosing to, I guess I don't have to learn Italian, but choosing to learn the language of astrology, how they've worked together in revealing this need for allowing it to wash over you and allowing the art of it. Because, yeah, I mean, we have structure to language, we have rules, we can put it together in a particular way. There is a right way of writing a sentence in a language that, there are those structures, but the expression, which is what we're really going for, is to express yourself, that you need to allow. And I think, like the thing that I've connected with the most then is I enjoy crafting together the elements in a chart just as much as a sentence or a paragraph. Like I love that. But also like what it's allowed for me personally, for myself, and in conversation with other people about their charts is I can weave together the feeling behind it as well, because obviously this is not an intellectual exercise alone. Just like if you want to express yourself in any language, it has a feeling component to it. And that's something that I think I didn't understand or realize or acknowledge about language before. So, yeah, that's been a pretty, very significant experience for me.
The process of learning language is also like a death, birth, rebirth process. Like you kind of have to deconstruct and then you have to reconstruct and then you put something back, but it's not like what it was before. So, yeah.
That really resonates as well because, you don't realize how, unless you have to, or unless you do start to learn some other language as an adult, I guess you don't realize what went into it or what's part of it. You just think it's just, the way we've been kind of conditioned to learn things. Learning astrology, and I think also learning a language it's the way that we maybe have been taught to traditionally learn is not necessarily the most effective for these two. And I think they share that in common. Well, because obviously astrology is a language too. So, yeah.
The way that it has affected me going deep down into this path in astrology and language, I feel back to Verena's point about left brain and right brain. Language is a left brain thing, but energy and archetypes and mythology and mysticism is the right brain. And it has created a sense of balance in my own consciousness. The archetypes, I went into business myself, so I know computer, I know programming languages, I'm in technology. I know the value of putting a precise, concise email together, a business case together to get your point across. What I lost in that line of work was my love for Greek mythology. So I didn't do that in university. But I brought back into what I thought were myths and symbolism of civilization and like history and the way that they thought about art. I have come to the understanding through this and through plant medicine as well, that archetypes are, they infuse our consciousness. And to understand the stories of the past, to understand the meanings, the originations of the words that are used today in everyday life, is a way to unlock the spell of illusion that some of us have been, not some of us, all of us have been programmed with in terms of learning this left brain view and not kind of being able to incorporate the right brain into it and have this wholesome view of what reality, mysticism, consciousness really is. So for me, it's been a dive deeper into my consciousness and humanity, and maybe combining the mind and the heart, and just kind of unlocking potential keys through the language of astrology into a broader view of dimensions that may not have been available in our 3D education and working system. So it's just given me so much. The whole time that we've been talking about this, there's been a woodpecker in a tree right in front of me. And I'm like, what's the woodpecker? Because why is he just sitting here? And the woodpecker is, somebody with woodpecker medicine is able to use concise language to always bring their view across and to bring enlightenment to other people. So I thought that was very interesting that this totem came in for this conversation right now.
Thank you, Kelly. Yeah, that's beautiful. I saw that you had a thought, Verena, about the analytical brain and the transiting notes. And then I definitely want to get to you, Jenny.
Yes, just to add to the beautiful thoughts that Kelly just mentioned, because of the left brain and the right brain, and that that astrology helps us to connect both of them. And I had this idea about, at the moment, we have the last degrees of the North Node in Gemini and the South Node in Sagittarius. And for me personally, it's so much about this, this balance between Gemini, which is more brought together with the left brain thinking, the logic, and Sagittarius, which is more brought together with the right brain, the intuition, the archetypal ways of thinking without logic. And now in the next months, in January 2022, the North Node will move into Taurus, the South Node into Scorpio. And I just had this feeling that at the moment we are balancing, maybe personally, maybe collectively, it's so much about information, it's so much about intuition. We are balancing these information versus intuition, what feels true for me, what is in the media. So this whole dance between left brain and right brain. And I think there will be maybe an opening or maybe a deepening relating to language when the nodes move into Taurus, because Taurus is so much for me about body language, about things like plant language, or talking with plants, talking with nature, talking with animals, animal communication, body communication, the wisdom of the body. So I think maybe this whole language topic will much more deepen and expand in the next year, maybe. And I think that's something for you, Jonathan, personally, with this wonderful podcast project that you're starting right now, so that we can pull the whole language topic from Gemini to Taurus, and from Sagittarius, the wisdom which comes more from traveling, from experience, the inner guru, into the deep, deep spheres of Scorpio, the underworld. And I think that's going to be very juicy.
I love that. Also, Taurus rules my 9th house, so I'm all for that. Yeah. Thank you, Verena.
Oh my gosh, Verena, that's so incredible to think about. First of all, I love thinking about language as a spirit. And when we start thinking about language in all of these other forms, I mean, body language, energetic language, whatever that is, I love conceptualizing around that. What is something that's even beyond language? If language is simply about meaning making, right? Like we're trying to make meaning of something, and oftentimes it's of our own lives. I think there's an incredible vast possibility in astrology that I don't often encounter in other spaces. And I think Sabrina talked a little bit about this too. There's, I think Nietzsche was the one that talked about reason killing God, right? And when I think about Western psychology and the DSVM and basically pathologizing people, and that seems like such an empirical fixed way of understanding human nature, there's something about astrology that fills and sort of reinfuses that sort of divine, that God back into reason. And that's why I'm really drawn to astrology and the language and the framework, because I get something different. Even if the sort of energetic quality of an archetype is similar between different astrologers, it is always different. There's always a different sort of tinge or a lens or a filter in which the language always feels like it's shifting to me. And then it's really slippery, which is I actually have my North Node in Gemini and South Node in Sagittarius, and I also have my my Mercury in Capricorn. So that constant shifting, that constant filtering through, or the fact that it always feels a little elusive is one, I think, part of always constantly challenging my sense of any sort of conception of a fixedness in reality, or a fixedness in identity, or a fixedness in any sort of meaning making. And that is something that's like really incredibly, I think, valuable in the way that astrology works. That it does really, it infuses the sort of inexplicability of the divine into something that is sort of explicable because it's in language, but it's always slippery. It's always changing, which is essentially the inherent experience of us as humans, is that we're constantly changing. So to have, I think, a framework that also mirrors that is incredible. It feels right to me, if there is a sense of any sort of rightness. Yeah.
You know, before we pressed record, Jenny, I pulled the Magician card among other cards that I pulled. And I've been thinking a lot about like spirit communication or like channeling or that kind of idea, right? Because I think we're always channeling. The thing is, we think, like, we don't use that language, but an artist, you know, creating a painting or a novelist writing a book is channeling, you know? When you create your business presentation deck, and Kelly can probably relate to this. Like when I have to create a deck, you know, for like my corporate job, like I create something out of nothing, you know? And so there's like a way in which we are always channeling. We're just not always conscious of it, and we're not always skillful around it. And I think that one of the things that I've been wrestling with is this idea of like, what does it mean to be a clear channel, right? Because I think being educated under this more mechanistic perspective, we can think about how there's one objective view, right? But like, is that even a possibility? Or is our job really to like clear out what is not meant to be coming through us, you know? Because for example, right, I may really love writing lyrics, you know, but if a novel comes through me, maybe it's best that I leave that idea and leave it to someone like Sabrina, right? This is just an example, but you know, like thinking about what idea is here for us to explore and what idea is not here for us to explore, I feel like that to me feels much more in alignment with this idea of like keeping a clear channel rather than like being this blank space, because it's impossible for any of us to be a blank space. But anyways, yeah.
I think, Jonathan, where the charts come in is like having that inner knowing of your own chart and that analysis and working with the symbology of your chart and planets. It can guide you into the right space for your channeling, or not the right space, but the space that it gives you the surrender and the openness. Like it can put you in and zone you in to where you need to go. Because I do feel that with the collective consciousness, we have so much available to us all the time. And that might be perhaps our biggest issue in a few years, because there's so much information. So how do we take all of these information, these words, these ideas, and create something of value that is part of our individual path? And I think that the language within our charts is able to guide us into and steer us in the right direction.
I wanted to add too about the the channel concept, that Vesta came in my mind when you were talking about that. And Vesta and Hermes have a connection in the mythology. They're not like married per se, but they have this like relationship. And I think about Vesta as like temple space or having a frequency, and the kind of question of like what frequency are we devoted to? What are we intending to channel? And one practice that I play with, that I've done for a lot of my life, is writing in a journal, but writing from a tinted perspective, right? Like I can be kind of in a weird mood, but if I decide to write through my day through the perspective that it was really magical in some way, then my mood actually changes. And I start to notice what was actually magical. And then maybe when I'm done writing, the day takes a turn for the better. And this can happen with like a gratitude practice as well, like searching for more things to be grateful for. It's like there's some participatory part of the universe that's like, cool, let me send you more things for your gratitude practice. So I think that Vesta and Mercury, work together in that way, where it's like we can pick up information from any channel at all. But if we have a fire that we're tending, like Vesta in the myth is like keeping a certain fire lit and not letting it go out. So kind of deciding what we want to be tending, then Mercury like has a pathway. And it's kind of like, for example, with like an archetype, Taurus, any of the archetypes, but just Taurus, for example, Taurus isn't limited. Like there's an infinite amount of information about Taurus, but by focusing on the Taurus archetype, we can glean like more of that possibility. So I think that channel and focus and devotion came to mind.
Along the same lines as that, I was thinking of Mercury as the lower octave of Uranus. And I think of Uranus as the downloader, like you just download from that, like that is where you receive, all that is being channeled towards you, and Uranus as non-linear time, or that, time is actually not linear at all, and it's only like the present moment, and you can get from source and then bring that into Mercury, which is then to express all that. So I really feel that, and I feel that like my day job is writing nowadays, is not teaching anymore, but writing maths questions all day long, right? Because that might sound like really horrible. It's not, though. I do it totally as like a channeled process. I totally think, okay, so this is what I have to do. What am I feeling? Which one am I feeling is just going to flow through me, and that's the one that I do, and then it just comes out of me like that. I acknowledge it's like I have a part in it, but really it's just like definitely I'm just channeling that. I'm just receiving whatever feels good, like whatever feels like the inspiration for the right way to construct a set of questions. So yeah, that's really interesting, this idea of channel.
I wanted to add something about Mirella's wonderful thoughts with Uranus and Mercury and Sabrina's Vesta Temple Mercury relation. I think that on the one hand, yes, having Mercury in the 12th house, I can relate so much, because I think Pisces has this openness to information wherever it comes from too, and Uranus for sure too. So this download of ideas, this idea of having, like the Akashic records, having this field of information, and with our Mercury we can pull some information and translate it. So I had this, when I opened my Akashic records last night, I had really this picture of light, which I can translate into language, into courses, into projects, so that everything is just a translation of the light. So, and I think that is a wonderful idea. And on the other hand, it can be so overwhelming to have this field of information. And our Gemini Sagittarius part can have the feeling of exploding because of this Uranian field of information. So what do we need? We need Virgo. We need, and here we come to the temple idea. We come, because I had not to think about Vesta, but Vesta is, some kind, same, but different. I had to think about the priestess energy of Virgo, the discernment. And we had last year so many times we had Vesta in Virgo squaring the nodes. So for many months. So this idea of, okay, we need to discern. We need to discern what we want to channel, what we want to be a clear channel for, that actually serves us and serves the world. And I think that there is something with the channeling. There's something like a mutual reception between the Mercury, who picks up the information, and the Uranian quality, or the maybe Piscean quality too, who gives the information. I think that in a way we have to be open to learn, and we have to do our studies so that we prepare the ground. We prepare like a rich soil and ground by learning, by reading, by do our research, by go to the classes, so that then when we have prepared a little bit of the soil, we cannot create the whole tree alone, but we can prepare the soil. And then we can be open that the seed flops from the heaven into our ground, and then the magic can happen.
Wow. I love that, Verena. I was really feeling this connection between what you're saying and what Maddie was saying about how, language can be a way or a vessel for us to manifest what we want. So I'm curious if you would want to speak more about that, Maddie. And maybe how that even relates to your own experience or your astrological journey thus far.
Yeah, so when I think about language, I think about how my life's changed so much. And now when I'm trying to explain myself or kind of explain what's going on, astrology is most likely used in it. And so I feel like it's kind of just been like evolving me as well as evolving everyone around me, really getting us in touch with the language. And the more that I use it, the more that I see like things come into my life. And I just use language to manifest anything. The more that you say it, you speak it out, things start to come towards you. Very simple manifestation.
Can I interject? This isn't actually, first of all, I love this channeling conversation, but something that I'm also reminded about in terms of language is how, and I talked about this a little bit earlier, about how stuck it can get, right? I'm also just thinking about the ways in which some people just flatten astrology into just basic sun signs, or like, oh, I hate all Scorpios, right? Because they're vengeful. I'm also just reminded of this hilarious Guardian article about back in 2019 about Capricorns need not apply. Is it legal to pick a roommate by astrological sign in New York? Because they had... So there's also like, it just, so I think that we have to be really careful with language, right? And talking about Sagittarius and dogma, right? Like that desire, I think, to take language and to create a sort of cosmology, but a very dogmatic cosmology too, is like a danger when we're thinking about language. So that's just something that came through when I was thinking about how I've also seen other people who understand astrology in a lay way, using it in a way that just, it's very categorical. It's also used in a way to separate people. And how can we ensure that the future doesn't include this, right?
Yeah. I've been thinking a lot about how some of the challenge we currently have with astrology, or that I've observed people coming into learning or reading spaces with, is this idea that like the whole chart is you, right? Which is true and not true, because it is like, it does provide a certain lens through which, as Maddie was saying, it's like a prism through which you like filter your experience, right? And at the same time also, there are things outside of your control. And I think to discount or to disregard the possibility for other things to also like filter through, you know, the birth chart, and for you to be able to see things in the birth chart as other than you, like it seems really difficult for folks to like the other day I had a session where someone was just kind of broken open with this idea that, you know what, like your Mercury being in, you know, the traditional language, right, being in detriment or fall, kind of doesn't really have anything to do with you. Like it has to do with how the world around you sees language and experiences language, and how, you know, maybe you are going in opposition with that, you know, and what you're feeling about how you express yourself is stuck because of the world around you. And, you know, not just like the responsibility is not just on you.
I think that language, like the language of astrology, which I'm still learning, helps it just helps like my view of the world not seem so rigid. And it feels like it's like a spirit of connection. And astrology is sort of like a language of movement for me, which does help me connect more to my dreams. And it's like, it just helps me lean and melt into a more fluid way of seeing the world versus just like, even though I use like English or Spanish to like describe astrology, it's not really like the words that I use. It's more of like what I see, feel, and perceive. And I learned language, like I learned English first. No, I learned Spanish first, and then I learned English. But I was still learning, I was learning them at the same time. So for me, it was like a lot of decoding. Like we only spoke Spanish here at home. But then when I would go to school, it would be, I felt a little bit isolated. So with English and Spanish, there's like a little bit of pain attached to it. Because I just had to like constantly like shift the ways that I was like communicating with people. But then astrology is like, it just gives me room to breathe. And there's not really pain attached to it. It's a way for me to like witness myself and others.
Yeah, I really like what you said, Fabiola, about using astrology as a way to kind of witness yourself, because I kind of have always felt like I've used language as a way to kind of disguise myself. So, for example, growing up, I've always been a really great imitator. Like I've always been able to pick up on like the inflections or the accents of the people that I'm around to just kind of blend in. And then as I got older and I learned Spanish, I almost felt like I used to kind of hide behind speaking Spanish as well. You know, I felt like it was a way to kind of like, you know, because I've always had a lot of problems articulating myself. And then when I would speak Spanish, I would kind of feel accepted because it's like, oh, they're not going to think I'm stupid. They're just going to think that, you know, I'm learning this language, and I can kind of just hide my insecurities about myself behind that. And with astrology, it just kind of feels like, I mean, I do talk about it to other people, but in terms of like getting to know myself and as a self-study, it just kind of feels like a language that's just for me. You know, like if I don't want to share it with anybody, that's fine. But and even if I do, it's like I don't have to hide behind it. I don't have to make it represent something that I don't feel comfortable with myself about. You know, it's just it's helped me, like Fabiola was saying, like really witness myself and really just get to know myself in a way that I've never been able to do before. So yeah, that's really it. But yeah, thank you for this, Jonathan, because it's really kind of making me realize so many things. So
Thank you, Nicole. Yeah, I do feel like a lot of us come into this language because all the other languages that we've been engaging does not sufficiently describe our experience to, I don't know, or like there's something about how we've been using language that limits us instead of liberates us. And in learning and kind of using this, you know, archetypal language, we're opened up, you know.
So I think if I recall correctly, Jonathan, you kind of opened the question to us about the spirit of language in relation to astrology. And beforehand, when we opened up the session, we went through a breathing exercise with you as well. And you spoke about the etymology of inspiration being linked to breath. So one of the things that I was doing was I was just, because of my own academic training in linguistics and in language, especially the English language, I was just going through the etymology of certain words, namely the etymology of spirit, the etymology of language, and from there, trying to kind of link back to the other planet that you mentioned and the deity Hermes and Mercury. So what's quite uncanny is just on the side of my desk, I have a card of, I don't know if you can see it, of Hermes. So I had no idea that that was going to be kind of brought up. So I'm kind of glad that he's overseeing what I'm about to say. So if we go to the etymology of spirit, we kind of go to like the Proto-Indo-European word of it. It comes from to blow, or to like the kind of the breath that you mentioned. And again, so that's kind of, you know, so embodied breath, and it kind of centered us at the start of the recording. And then if we go to the etymology of language, we have lingua, or even the Proto-Indo-European root, I won't pronounce, which also means tongue. So we've got breath, we've got tongue. And if you look at the kind of traditional significations of Mercury and the anatomical links to Mercury, those are the realms of Mercury, the tongue and breath. So, you know, you kind of introducing the question to us, just even from a very embodied place, is so mercurial in nature. And everybody here in the group was speaking about the co-learning of languages, whether it's English and astrology with Verena, whether it's, with myself, I was there's a kind of a co-development of learning the language of depth psychologies and psychodynamic psychotherapies and astrology. That's kind of, they came hand in hand in my own personal development. And so I was learning to speak to myself at the same time as speaking from myself, capital S, in a Jungian sense, as well as also understanding the kind of archetypal language through the zodiac, that is, through astrology. And if we go to the etymology of the zodiac itself, it's this circle of animals. Again, a very embodied, living, vitalizing, diadem, this kind of crown that we all kind of are lucky to be able to place on our brow, and from that place, speak something that is not only true to us, but true of the world and true of the other. And the shared, privilege of speaking the same language has meant that, especially in the container that Sabrina has created, across the Atlantic Ocean, from Verena and Mirella and myself in Europe, all the way to, the North American continent where everybody else is sitting here. There's a real beauty that we can share, that the power of the language of astrology. I think it's just ultimately just, so beautiful, really. A lot of people have been also talking about the magic of the language of astrology, I think in the chat especially. And I couldn't help but think about Ursula K. Le Guin's work, which is all about the magic of words. And I'm just going to share a few quotes, and then hopefully I'm going to link it all together. There's one quote from A Wizard of Earthsea where Ursula K. Le Guin writes, "For a word to be spoken, there must be silence before and after." And then she says in another work, she says, "When you speak a word to a listener, the speaking is an act, and it is a mutual act. The listener's listening enables the speaker's speaking. It's a shared event, intersubjective. The listener and the speaker entrain with each other." And then, she goes on to say, "This is why utterance is magic. Words do have power. Names have power. Words are events. They do things, change things. They transform both the speaker and the hearer. They feed energy back and forth and amplify it. They feed understanding or emotion back or forth and amplify it." And then in another extract, she says, "So people seek that irreproducible moment, the brief, fragile community of story told among people gathered together in one place, like we're doing here. So children gather at the library to be read to. They look at the little circle of faces, like how we look at the circle of the animals in the sky, blazing with intensity. So the writer on a book tour, reading in the bookstore, and her group of listeners reenact the ancient ritual of the teller at the center of the circle. The living response has enabled that voice to speak. Teller and listener, each fulfills the other's expectation. The living tongue that tells the word, the living ear that hears it, bind and bond us in the communion we long for in the silence of our inner solitude." And I think that's what astrology and the spirit of the language of astrology can really do. And it's, the greatest privilege that during 2021, Sabrina's invited me and all of us here to be together around that circle, around this circle, in order to kind of capture and embody and enliven us with that spirit of the language of the zodiac. And I think really for me, that's something that is, it's a privilege, but it's also something that I also feel is a right. All of us, when we show up each time today, we kind of assert our right to speak, the freedom to speak and the freedom to listen and communicate this particular, the spirit of the language. It makes me think of the word logos, capital L. When we're talking about astrology, we very rarely talk about the logos of astrology. And I think it's a space, Jonathan, I feel as though with your work and your podcast, that you'll be able to open up this kind of very fascinating avenue of research and meaning making. What is the logos of astrology? And probably your guests, and the people that you will speak to in each conversation, like building that circle together, maybe that logos and the nature of that, of what they'll say, can kind of enliven the listener to that spirit of the language of astrology. So good luck, and so yeah, definitely, I think it's a wonderful question.
The fear of speaking, and I think, Jonathan, that creating a podcast is an act of revolution. And I think that astrology as a language is a way, maybe for the one or the other, to overcome the fear of speaking. And I see that so much in the inconjunct between Gemini and Scorpio, and the inconjunct between Capricorn and Gemini. So this deep fear, Scorpio, of maybe being rejected, being outcast because of our spirituality, the witch wound, because of our maybe occult occult sides. And the Capricorn archetype, a shadow expression of the Capricorn archetype, the society, the rules of the society, and that when we speak, we say something wrong in the eyes of the public, and that we maybe in past lives have been killed because of that. And so we don't speak, we cannot speak because we are full of fear to speak. And so this relationship between Capricorn and Scorpio to Gemini, and I think all the inconjunct, I always think about the sentence, it's complicated. So and I think that it's complicated. Gemini always wants to have a fantastic and very creative way to find maybe a language so that we can overcome this fear and that we can overcome this repression or and I think that astrology is a language, maybe for some of us, a new language where we can find back to our truth and a way to communicate our truth and our spirituality, Scorpio, in a way that, in a good way, fits in a certain pattern or a certain frame or a certain. It has a construct, Capricorn, but in a good way. So we speak about the certain planets, but there's enough space to breathe, Gemini. So it's not too dense or too repressive or something like that. So I think that astrology is really magical in that way, and that it can be freeing. And I think, or I had this impression of, astrology can be a way to reclaim our true language and to free our tongue, lingua, and to break free in a way. And that doing a podcast or speaking about astrology in public or doing a workshop, it's always, and I feel that very much when I, in Germany, go out in the public and present a class and present a course. I feel the fear. And it's always an act of revolution and an act of healing, and healing not only ourselves, but healing our ancestries, and for that, healing everybody who comes after us. So I think speak freely, and maybe in the language of astrology, maybe in another language, whatever resonates with your soul, is always, in a way, an act of revolution or an act of re-empowering of the soul to be courageous enough to speak whatever is true in this moment for the soul.
I feel that like in my bones, Verena. I'm a Pluto in third house person, so yeah, totally. There's a lot of conversation, and I think rightfully so, right, around how astrology is a language. And my felt sense of it is that, yes, it's a language and it's all these other things that perhaps we haven't quite yet codified or like we haven't quite yet explored. And the other thing that I kind of wanted to bring to the table was, how the language of astrology itself has really evolved over the course of even our short lives. Like most of us here were born in probably like the 80s to 90s, right? And how the use of astrology and even like the different branches of astrology that are in vogue have changed a lot, from like when I started studying astrology by myself like 10 years ago. And so I'm really curious to hear like if all of you have any thoughts around like how to revolutionize like the language of astrology itself, and maybe if there's anything other, like is astrology also more than a language? And if so, if it's more than a language, like what is it?
I have some thoughts.
I do too.
I went to Norwalk one year where Rick Tarnas was giving a keynote, and he said something that always stuck with me, which was that it's good to combine astrology with other disciplines, because it enriches the astrology and it enriches the other disciplines. And so if we want to use like language, it's like astrologers are multilingual. And I think we've been like kind of uncovering that here. But, for example, when I was learning about Saturn, I think I was like getting the real Saturn download, like beyond the caricature of Saturn. But when I was like being initiated into a gnosis of what Saturn is, I was also learning law of attraction via like Abraham Hicks teachings. And I made this connection between karma and cause and effect with these like new age spiritual teachings. And that has forever changed how I talk about Saturn and think about Saturn, with this like very, possibility centered realism in some sense, but also kind of magical. So, and then Rudy bringing in depth psychology, right? Like, I think part of, the field of astrology growing richer, or astrology being a revolutionary force, is like the bridging of astrology between other things, because you have maybe herbalists who connect with astrology, and that is an amazing, process for them and who they're engaging with.
Gosh, Sabrina, we're on the exact same page, because that's exactly what I was going to say, which is such a Gemini Mercury thing to do, right? To take different parts, to collect all this information, and then to synthesize it, to create, to get to an even greater truth. And when I think about it, I think about, how colonized the English language is, and actually how closed off and how many blind spots we actually have to our lived experience, and how oppressive that can actually be. So when I think about it, I'm like, what other languages exist that don't center innovation or capitalism at its center? And there's actually this indigenous community in Alabama. I think you pronounce it the Muskogee people, but they're creating an intentional community that centers their Muskogee language, which has been developed next to the natural world versus the English language, and how capitalism doesn't even factor into their worldview because the language grammatically doesn't contain those structures. And so like I'm like, I can't even conceptualize that because I grew up speaking English. And there's an indigenous intentional community that's starting up in Alabama. And I think about integrating that into this sort of divine study of the planets. Or I think about Buddhism and evolutionary astrology. I've always felt that inherent dovetailing of the concepts of reincarnation, and all this talk around channeling and the study of the mind in Buddhism and consciousness, like how similarly they are in terms of parallel studies. And Buddhism is all about checking your patterned will, right? And so how can we also do that in alignment with, so I'm all about integrating things. I think that that's how we create these like new, interesting, revolutionary structures. Like the future of the language is, I think, is really at those moments of intersection. So I totally agree with you, Sabrina, 100%. I'm like, how can we get more people with different disciplines in this space?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, Jenny, because I keep thinking about people that have indigenous cultures, especially because I've been learning Quechua with my Andean cosmology, and just how such one word can have a universe of meaning to it. And back to the throat and the breath and chanting. I feel that the linguistics of other languages, there's a known, something that we might not be completely aware of in the West, is that the vibration of your throat has a very connected feeling to creating your reality. So if you start to play with that in the throat and the tongue, like you were talking about, Rudy, and we are a little bit more intentional with what we're doing, we draw in more meaning. But because there is this colonized language that we've been working through, back to me, it's a spell, right? We confuse ourselves. We have these layers of veils in front of us because our words are actually always creating that. And if we think about astrology in the term of the Western view, it's taking things, there's still veils that need to be lifted. And I feel that there's so much that it's almost like that we're in this kaleidoscope of understanding, and that the consciousness is starting to move very fast. I also wanted to say to you, Jonathan, like I've been playing with, people are so short attention spans now, right? So it's hard we've talking about like, how do you communicate with your platform and keep people's attention? And so I've been playing with little memes that say a lot with one sentence, but then also with lyrics in the stories. Like I've been trying to combine the two so that the 30 seconds says something, whether people are understanding that they don't have to read 2 paragraphs of what my thoughts are, but they're getting like a little bang on soundbite. And I'm trying to create impact that way. So I'm trying to play as well.
Yeah. I even see that with how we incorporate things like the asteroids, right? I remember when in this course, we opened ourselves up to the asteroid goddesses, like something really shifted in our collective space, and there's like more space to make or to assign meanings to maybe things that were kind of like Venusian, and then maybe also kind of Sagittarian, and then, like in the melding of that, we find maybe form in like Vesta or something like that, right? And how like that's also part of creating new language, and furthering this language has to do with expanding that vocabulary of the archetypes.
Because of this idea of the fastening of language, or that it all gets quicker and quicker. And I think not language, because of our world, that becomes quicker and quicker. And we are in the transition phase to a new dimension, which is opening up. And it's very uncomfortable for us now, because we are not used to the new time, or to the new idea how time can flow. And for that, how language can flow. And we are in a huge transition change period. And I think that it is so important that we change our language too. And especially in astrology too, to bring it back to your question, Jonathan, that you had at the beginning with astrology and new language. I think that we have these the archetypes, and in a more traditional sense, these description of the planets and of the which school you have, maybe the houses as well. They are in a box in a way, or they can be in a box in a way. And I think that it's one of our tasks as astrologers now, who live in this transitioning times, that we widen the astrological language too, because the time is changing. And for that, I think so, that the archetypes are changing too. And I think it is more important than ever that we really get into the conversation with the planets, and that we live the astrology in the world as it is right now, not as it was in the Renaissance, or not as it was in Hellenic times in Old Greek, but now. And that we work with our transits as astrologers, that we see, okay, Venus, what is she actually doing right now in my life? How do I live the transit so that we can widen our perspective? What does it mean when Jupiter is in this place in my chart, and what is happening in my life? So what is really the felt experience? So it's a little bit like an exploration, or a field study, how we can widen the archetypes and the ideas that are in astrology already set up about them. And I think the asteroids are so cool and so great and so opening and expansive because there's not so much thing about them written down. So we have this white sheet of paper and we can look, okay, like I do with Diana now, I can explore the archetype very, very freely, because there's not so much about her in astrological terms. And I think that with the transitional planets, it would be really expensive. And I know that we all in this group, we do that so that we can rethink Mercury retrograde phase, that we can rethink and find new ideas what maybe Venus can mean now in this now totally changed times in which we live now.
I also love this concept of the field study, the chart as a field study, and how living into the planets of your chart is actually different. So we all have Venus, right? We all have all the planets, we all have all the signs in our chart, but the sort of lived in experience of each person's field experience is different. I just like got this image of all of us like going out into a field with like our sun hats and like our little picks and just like digging it. I don't know. I'm an earth sun sign. So I just like figure us like digging up bones or something, just like field studying ourselves. But I love that though. And every answer is right. Like that's the thing for each person. Right. I love that.
Yeah. And I mean, Jenny, I love that because I think that, to even highlight this, I think 50 years ago, the Venus archetype, when I think about my mother, and she grew up in the 60s, and what did it mean to embody Venus for her?
Yeah. And also to that end, Verena, I feel like what I've been really feeling into is, thinking about astrology as a devotional practice, right? That we are always influenced by our times and by our channel and how, we've been conditioned, that we can only see like a sliver of that archetype, right? And so as we progress in our study and in our practice, we change how we relate to the archetype. Like the archetype shows a different facet than what we normally see as we change our lens.
I wanted to comment on that because one of the things that was like a meditation kind of opening for me in the earlier parts of my deep astrology study was to consider all of the archetypes as like infinitely mysterious, and they are beings, there's a sentience, and that I can't claim to know them in a collapsed way. And to bring in Rick Tarnas again, he has this parable of the two suitors in Cosmos and Psyche, where what energy are we bringing to get to know the universe and imagining that we're courting the universe? And he's describing these two different approaches where, imagine approaching someone that you're courting, but you assume that you are more intelligent than them, that you know everything about them, and that they are just there for you to extract from and use to your benefit, versus approaching a suitor who you see as mysterious and equally, if not more intelligent than you, and you seek to know them, not to control or dominate them, but to like deepen into this like enhanced kind of like collective understanding with each other. And I see that with like just the way that we engage our relationship with astrology. I think for anyone wanting to have like a personal revolution with astrology, the moment that you give up any collapsed narrative about your chart or a planet or a sign and inquire into who is this being really, or what is this energy really, like, I seek to know you, and have that genuine openness, that we will actually be transformed. Like, there's just a deeper kind of relational quality to that, as opposed to that coming in, assuming we know. And I think, this goes for how we relate to the plant world and animals as well. I find, like, I'm always like marvel at how people who meet my cat, like, will bring out a different side of her that I've never seen before, because they're relating to her in a way that I don't. And I see my cat has a facet of her personality that I didn't even know existed. And I'm stunned by that. Right. And like, just that sense of being able to be surprised by anyone or anything, any being that we're in relationship with, including the planets, and being mindful of the language that we're using. And if we're using language to form caricatures or reductions of these archetypes.
I think even like the genius of the title of your podcast, The Magic of the Spheres, just those 3 simple words, it can take away, it allows the energy to be embodied in that relation and in the intimacy that we work through with the planets. And like most of your teachings, like you're connecting and you're dancing with the planet. And it's not just about reading a blurb in a book somewhere and, memorizing that and memorizing symbols. And you're teaching Sabrina and all of us through this course now, we're having this intimate dance. And I think that speaks to decolonizing some of the things, because a lot of the language in the books that were written in the past, it's like, this is the way it is, and thou shalt, and you must remember, and these are the rules, and you can't go away from that. But we're going more into working with energy, which is a more indigenous way of connecting to the earth, the planet, the stars. And once you get into that space, it's less about looking outward as it is about receiving and channeling the energy to come in, where then it's up to you to be able to vocalize, and translate what you've received. And then we're actually really in that intimate connection, rather than just memorization and repetitive analysis as we move through.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that, Kelly.
Oh, it was just in relation to what you and I think Sabrina were mentioning with regards to the language of astrology. And you mentioned devotion, and Sabrina was speaking about that more of an animist relation to the planets and to the cosmos, and using that wonderful parable in Cosmos and Psyche in order to kind of enchant and to, encourage enchantment with you and the universe itself. What I was thinking of was, I was looking at some of the etymology of some of the words that you had used to open our discussion today, Jonathan. And one of the words that came to me was oration. And I wanted to look at the kind of, the etymology of that. And it kind of just really, I hadn't really considered that this was the etymology of what the word is. And it comes from the Latin for a prayer. So, oration is not only just to have the kind of speaking or speech, or the faculty of speech, or expressing, or, speaking before an assembly in a very Roman way. Oration can also mean a prayer. And there's something about the oration of astrology, where we speak in prayer between the planets and ourselves. And I just think that that's where that devotional relationship can start to occur. And that's, I think, hinting to possibly a way to look beyond language. Even though prayer and to speak, a prayer requires some language. I think all of us have been in a situation where prayer surpasses language. It's an affect. It's even a sensation, actually. We can pray with our body. We can pray with our feelings. Sometimes words aren't even used when we're in prayer. So the oration of astrology, which sounds so grand and formal, and it sounds like, you could argue the podcast voice, which I think if everybody can understand what that means here, there is this kind of, the New York Times did a brilliant article which used audio clips where it kind of dissected and deconstructed the podcast voice, which seems to be a very particular register when people speak on a podcast compared to other forms of communication. So hopefully, like actually beyond that register, the actual prayer, the oration of astrology isn't just within the level of a podcast or within the conversation that we're having today, but also can be the prayer of astrology itself. So I think that's one of the key threads here, that Sabrina's allowed the container for us not to only speak in the spirit of astrology, and what Verena was mentioning earlier, the freedom to speak in the spirit of astrology, but I think also the art, the oration, the rhetoric of astrology, I think is as key too.
So I feel like I can really speak to all of you about this like forever, but I do want to bring us to a closure here, and I'm curious if any final thoughts are coming up for any of you.
I just wanted to thank you, Jonathan, for this space. There's just been times during this conversation where I felt kind of like my eyes like watering, because this has just been so beautiful and profound. And so I'm just really grateful for you creating this container for this conversation and for everyone's beautiful shares.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I feel like this group just always brings the A game by just breathing, which is really incredible. I learned so much from every one of you, and throughout this conversation and throughout our time together. So I'm really, really grateful for that. And thank you, Sabrina, for bringing us together. Wow. I was in that conversation. I listened to it again while I was editing. And even then, I'm still blown away by the magic that was breathed, articulated, ideated in this space. I hope you found it incredible too. In case you are listening to this and you are curious to learn more about Meteorite, you can find the link in the show notes, among the many links that I have in the show notes for this episode. I believe that you have to be a graduate of Sabrina's Evolutionary Astrology Intensive in order to join the course. But if you have been studying evolutionary astrology or even astrology in general for some time, you may want to reach out to Sabrina to see if you can join Meteorite. As I mentioned, you can also find the links for all of my classmates in the show notes if you want to connect with them, support them, or get sessions with them. If you found this podcast or this conversation to be inspiring, nourishing, or helpful in one way or another, I would absolutely love it if you could subscribe, rate, or review this podcast with 5 stars, or whatever is the highest ranking on your podcast app. If you think someone else will benefit from this episode, please share them too, whether that's on social media, with a friend, or with your community. All right, until next time, I hope you take good care of yourself, and I'm sending you so much love. Thank you for listening.